All right, listen up, class. When you think of George Washington, what pops into your tiny tick-tock-addled brains? Is it the boring old guy on the $1 bill, looking like he just smelled a fart in an elevator? Is it the guy who chopped down a cherry tree and couldn't tell a lie, because he was a total goody-two-shoes? We'll delete that mental file immediately, because the real George Washington, he was absolute chaos. He was a 6'2" ginger giant in an era when the average man was the size of a hobbit. He was a man who loved money, possessed the strongest plot armor in human history, and I cannot stress this enough, had a mouthful of absolute nightmares. Forget the wooden teeth myth. Wood gets soggy. Washington wasn't walking around with a rotting log in his mouth. No, his dentures were a terrifying steampunk contraption made of gold-lead hippopotamus ivory and human teeth that he bought from his own slaves. And they were spring-loaded. That's right. If he opened his mouth to relax, the springs would fire the teeth out of his face. He had to actively clench his jaw 24/7 just to keep his face from exploding. That's why he never smiled in portraits. He wasn't serious. He was holding back a dental projectile weapon. But before he became the father of America, he was just a confused, socially awkward 20-something trying to get rich. Let's rewind to 1732 in Virginia. Little George is born into the gentry, which is a fancy word for people who own land, but aren't rich enough to be cool yet. Here's the first myth we need to bust: the cherry tree. You know the story. 6-year-old George gets a hatchet, chops his dad's favorite tree, and says, "I cannot tell a lie." Complete fanfiction. It was made up by a guy named Parson Weems years after Washington died to sell books to gullible parents. The real George Washington didn't care about cherry trees. He cared about math. See, George's dad died when he was 11, while his older brothers got sent to England to go to fancy boarding schools and learn how to drink tea with their pinkies. Out George had to stay home. He was essentially homeschooled. He didn't learn Latin or Greek philosophy. He learned how to measure land. He became a surveyor. Imagine a teenager today whose only hobby is Minecraft. That was George. He spent weeks in the wilderness, sleeping with bears and lice, measuring property lines for cash. This actually made him incredibly tough. He wasn't a soft aristocrat. He was an outdoorsman who could strangle a turkey with his bare hands while calculating the hypotenuse of a triangle. Washington goes home, reports the failure, and gets promoted to lieutenant colonel because literally no one else wants the job. He returns in 1754 with a bunch of militia and a Native American ally named Tana Grisson, also known as the Half-King. The British are running around like headless chickens. Enter George Washington. He has dysentery at the time. He has to put a pillow on his saddle because his butt hurts so much. But when the bullets start flying, something supernatural happens. Overnight, George goes from upper middle class to Virginian Bezos. He accepts, famously saying, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," which is 18th century speak for, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but let's roll." It wasn't a huge strategic victory, but psychologically it was massive. It proved the Americans could actually win. Washington's approval rating skyrockets. Winter 1797, Valley Forge. If you think camping is fun, try camping with no food, no shoes, and smallpox. Washington's army is starving. They are eating fire cake, which is just flour and water baked on a rock. It tastes like sadness. Washington is stressed. He's fighting Congress to get supplies. He's fighting his own generals who want to replace him, looking at you, Horatio Gates. But then a savior arrives. Baron von Steuben. He claims to be a Prussian general. He arrives in a sleigh with a greyhound dog wearing silk and medals. Truth. He wasn't a general. He was a disgraced captain who fled Europe because he was likely going to be arrested for homosexuality. Benjamin Franklin knew this and basically said, "I don't care who he kisses as long as he can teach these farmers how to march." Steuben doesn't speak English. He yells orders in German. When the soldiers don't understand, he yells in French. When they still don't understand, he asks his translator to swear at them in English for him. God damn your bayonet into the ground. He teaches them drill discipline and hygiene, like, don't poop near the kitchen, which was a revolutionary concept. By spring, the Continental Army is a professional fighting force, but Cornwallis is too salty to attend the surrender ceremony. He claims he's sick and sends his second-in-command to surrender to the French. The French point to Washington. The British officer has to hand his sword to Washington. Washington, being a petty genius, refuses to take it. He points to his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. Talk to the hand, Brit. The British band reportedly played a song called The World Turned Upside Down. The war is effectively over. America wins. He then goes to Congress, resigns his commission, and goes home to grow melons. When King George III heard Washington was going to give up power, he said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. But the presidency was a headache. He had two sons in his cabinet, Alexander Hamilton at Treasury and Thomas Jefferson at State. Hamilton wanted a strong central government, banks, and industry. Jefferson wanted a nation of farmers and hated banks. They fought constantly. Washington felt like a tired dad driving a minivan while his kids screamed in the back seat. If you two don't stop arguing about the national bank, I am turning this country around. He manages to keep the U.S. neutral when France and Britain go to war again. He crushes the Whiskey Rebellion farmers refusing to pay tax on booze by personally riding out with 13,000 troops. It's the only time a sitting president has led troops in the field. Imagine the president today hopping in a tank. After 2 terms, 8 years, people wanted him to run again. He could have been president for life. Washington said, "Nope, I'm done." He sets the precedent of the 2-term limit, which lasted until FDR broke it, and then we made it a law. His farewell address warns against 2 things: political parties, which we didn't listen to, and getting involved in foreign alliances, which we also didn't listen to. So how do we sum up George Washington? He wasn't a god. He was a man with flaws. The biggest, darkest stain on his legacy is slavery. He owned over 300 human beings. He was a strict master. He pursued escaped slaves relentlessly, even bypassing laws to do it. However, in his will, he became the only founding father to free his slaves upon Martha's death. It doesn't absolve him, but it shows he knew history was watching. He wasn't the smartest genius like Franklin. He wasn't a political theorist like Jefferson. He wasn't a financial wizard like Hamilton. But he was the essential man. He was the only person who could hold the army together. The only person everyone trusted with power, because they knew he could give it up. He was the glue. Without his height, his silence, his plot armor, and yes, his terrible teeth, the United States of America would probably just be a forgotten British colony, or 3 separate countries fighting over cheese. So next time you see a dollar bill, don't just see a wig. See a bulletproof, horse-riding, innovative, reluctant leader who set the standard for what a president should be, and then walked away. By age 20, his half-brother Lawrence died. People died a lot. Back then, spoilers ahead, and George inherited Mount Vernon. He also desperately wanted to join the British Army. He wanted the red coat. He wanted the clout. He wanted to be an influencer in the Virginia military scene. But the British looked at this tall, awkward colonial boy and said, "Lol, no, swipe left." So how does a rejected military wannabe become a hero? By accidentally starting the 7 Years' War, effectively the first true world war. Yes, that was him. In 1753, the French and the British were fighting over the Ohio River Valley. It's a nice piece of real estate. The British governor of Virginia sent 21-year-old Washington to deliver a letter to the French that politely said, "Get out." Washington treks through snow and ice, nearly drowns in a frozen river, arrives at the French fort, and hands them the letter. The French read it, laugh, sip their wine, and tell him to get lost. Now, Tanagrisson had his own agenda. He hated the French. He wanted a war to force the British to support his tribe. Washington was just the useful idiot he needed to start it. They stumble upon a small group of Frenchmen camping in a ravine called Jumonville Glen. Washington thinks, okay, we'll just surround them and ask for their license and registration. But the moment the shooting starts, chaos ensues. The French surrender. Washington starts to read them the riot act. Suddenly, the half-king walks up to the wounded French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, takes out a tomahawk, cracks his skull open, washes his hands in the guy's brain matter, and says, "I kid you not. Thou art not yet dead, my father." Washington stands there horrified. He just wanted to be a cool officer, and now he's an accomplice to a war crime. The French claim Jumonville was a diplomat. The British say he was a spy. Doesn't matter. Washington just lit the fuse on a global powder keg. After the oopsie at Jumonville, the French were pissed. They sent a massive army to chase Washington. George, in a panic, built a fort. He named it Fort Necessity. It was a terrible fort. He built it in a low-lying meadow. When it rained, the fort became a swimming pool. The French stood on the high ground and shot down at Washington's men like they were fish in a barrel. Washington surrendered the only time in his life he ever surrendered. He signed a confession, written in French, which he couldn't read, admitting he assassinated Jumonville. He goes home in disgrace. But wait, the British send a real General Edward Braddock to clean up the mess. Braddock invites Washington along as an aide. This leads to the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. It's a disaster. Braddock insists on fighting in straight lines in the middle of the forest. The French and natives hide behind trees and massacre them. Braddock gets shot in the lung. Every other officer gets killed. Washington rides back and forth across the battlefield rallying the troops. 2 horses are shot out from under him. He just grabs another one. When the battle ends and he takes off his coat, he finds 4 bullet holes through the fabric. 4. Not a single scratch on his body. He shook bullet fragments out of his hair. The Native American chiefs later said they told their best marksmen to aim specifically for the tall ginger on the horse, but their guns kept jamming or missing. They decided he was protected by the Great Spirit and stopped shooting at him. This is where the legend begins. Washington isn't smart yet, but he is apparently unkillable. After the war, Washington retires. He's tired of being shot at. He needs money. So he makes the best business decision of his life. He marries Martha Custis. Martha was a widow, a very, very wealthy widow. When she married George, she brought with her 17,000 acres of land and hundreds of enslaved people. For the next 15 years, Washington lives the life of a gentleman farmer. He grows tobacco, realizes tobacco ruins the soil, switches to wheat smart guy, and starts a whiskey distillery. He becomes a shopaholic. He orders fancy clothes from London, insisting on the tightest breeches possible to show off his legs. He was vain. He loved looking good. But rumblings are starting. The British are broke because of that war Washington started. So King George III decides to tax the colonies to pay for it. Stamp Act, hate it. Tea Act. Yeet it into the harbor. Washington is sitting at Mount Vernon reading the news, getting angrier. He's not a radical screamer like Sam Adams. He's the strong, silent type. When the First Continental Congress meets Washington shows up wearing his old military uniform, he doesn't say, "Pick me as general." He just stands there menacingly tall, wearing a uniform that screams, "I am the only person in this room who knows how to organize a kill streak." They pick him. The Declaration of Independence is signed. America is a thing. Now Washington has to fight the British Empire. Let's look at the stats. British largest navy in the world, professional soldiers, unlimited budget. Americans. A bunch of farmers with pitchforks, no shoes, gunpowder that turns to mush when it rains, and a Congress that refuses to pay them. The first major showdown is New York. It is a humiliation. The British flank Washington, smash his army, and nearly capture him. Washington's superpower here wasn't fighting. It was running away. He pulls off a miracle retreat across the East River at night, under the cover of fog. If the wind had blown the other way, the revolution would have ended right there. Washington is the Houdini of military history. He gets chased across New Jersey. His army is shrinking. Soldiers are leaving because their contracts are up. Morale is in the toilet. It's December 1776. If he doesn't win a battle soon, the revolution is canceled. Christmas night, 1776. Washington looks at the frozen Delaware River and says, "Hold my beer." Across the river in Trenton, New Jersey, are the Hessians. These are German mercenaries hired by the British. Terrifying guys. Popular myth: the Hessians were drunk from Christmas partying. Fact: they weren't drunk. They were just exhausted from constant patrols. Washington loads his men onto boats. It's sleeting. It's miserable. In the famous painting, Washington is standing heroically. In reality, if he stood up like that in a storm, he would have fallen into the water and died. But let's keep the image because it's cool. They cross the river. They march 9 miles in the snow. Some soldiers have no boots. They wrap their feet in rags, leaving bloody footprints. They attack Trenton at dawn. It's a massacre. The Americans catch the Hessians sleeping. The battle lasts like 45 minutes. Washington captures nearly 1,000 prisoners and suffers almost 0 casualties. Also, Washington pulls a medical gamble. Smallpox is killing more soldiers than British bullets. He orders inoculation. This isn't a modern vaccine. They take pus from a sick person's blister, cut open a healthy soldier's arm, and smear the pus inside. It's gross. It's risky. But it works. The death rate drops from 17% to 1%. Washington was a pro-science king. Fast forward to 1781. The war has dragged on for years. Everyone is tired. The British General Cornwallis makes a mistake. He backs himself into a corner at Yorktown, Virginia, waiting for the British Navy to pick him up. Surprise. The British Navy doesn't show up. The French Navy shows up instead. Shout out to the French. We literally could not have done this without them and their money. Thanks, Louis XVI. Sorry you got beheaded later. Washington on land, the French at sea. Cornwallis is trapped. The siege begins. The Americans shell the British day and night. Finally, Cornwallis surrenders. Now, here is the moment that makes Washington truly unique. History is full of generals who win revolutions and then declare themselves king dictator or supreme leader. Caesar, Cromwell, Napoleon. Washington had the army. He had the power. People wanted him to be King George I of America. In 1783 at Newburgh, his officers were angry about not getting paid. They were ready to overthrow Congress and install Washington as dictator. Washington walks into the meeting. He gives a speech. It's not working. Then he pulls out a letter from Congress. He pauses, reaches into his pocket, and pulls out a pair of reading glasses. Nobody had ever seen him wear glasses. To them, he was the invincible god of war. He says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Complete silence. Grown men start sobbing. The realization that he had sacrificed his youth and health for them broke the rebellion instantly. He enjoys retirement for like 5 minutes. The Articles of Confederation America's first government are trash. The country is falling apart. They call a constitutional convention in 1787. Washington goes just to oversee it. He sits in a big chair with a rising sun painted on it. He barely speaks, but his presence keeps everyone from killing each other. They write the Constitution. They create the office of the president, and everyone looks at George. It's you, bro. It has to be you. He didn't want it. He wanted to stay home with Martha and his dogs. He had dogs with weird names like Sweet Lips Drunkard and Vulcan, but he accepts. In 1789, he receives 100% of the electoral vote, the only president ever to do so. He defines the job. What do we call him? Your Highness? Your Majesty. His elective Highness. Washington says, just Mr. President. Simple. Humble. Iconic. He goes home to Mount Vernon in 1797. 2 years later, December 1799. He's riding his horse in the snow rain and hail mixture. He stays in his wet clothes to eat dinner because he's punctual. He wakes up with a sore throat. It gets worse. He can't breathe. It's likely epiglottitis, an infection of the throat. Now enter the 18th century doctors. If you think modern healthcare is expensive, 18th century healthcare cost you your life. Their solution to everything was, he has too much blood. Get the ghosts out of his blood. They bleed him. They take about 40% of his blood volume. They force him to drink a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter. He nearly chokes. They give him an enema. They put blister beetles on his throat to burn his skin. Washington, realizing the doctors are killing him faster than the disease, looks at them and says, "Let me go off quietly." He checks his pulse, his hand falls, and he dies. December 14, 1799, age 67.